about inflation, and we have been hearing about inflation control very often. So my question is, what are the parameters on which interest rate is determined? How is unemployment related to inflation? And is it important to ease the interest rate in order to boost investment and create jobs?
The interest rate is a crude instrument, but it's an instrument which can be used to moderate demand. So if interest rates are really high, then you don't want to go and buy your house because EMIs will be very high. You don't want to go buy a car because EMIs will be very high. And similarly, people who are thinking of investing will say, well, interest rates are going to stay very high, plus demand is not particularly good because people don't want to go out and buy take loans to buy stuff. So as a result, demand for goods and services falls, right? Why also services? Because once I'm not investing, I'm not building a plant, the architects, the other people who would help in building the plant also find that demand for their services fall, right? So why do we raise interest rates? Why can't we keep interest rates really low? If we keep interest rates really low all the time, demand would be very strong. And it may be that demand exceeds the supply potential of the economy, right? There's only so fast that factories can produce goods. Even today, if the demand is very high and I want to produce goods, I'll have to build a whole set of new factories. By the time they come on stream, the demand for those goods will already be there for some time. And so when demand exceeds supply by a large amount, prices go through the roof. So if you think high inflation is a bad thing, if you think that the fact that if you have high demand and it's not being produced in this country, you'll import from outside. You'll have a large current account deficit. So if you think these are bad things, then you have to modulate demand. And that is what the central bank does. We keep interest rates higher so as to keep demand at a level which is consistent with supply. Now, of course, there's a lot of pressure from people who say, oh, you're keeping interest rates too high, let us have more demand. But they also understand that they have more demand, they may have higher inflation unless the economy can produce what is necessary. At times when we see that the economy can produce what is necessary, we then cut the interest rates so that demand and supply can be equalized more. So when we cut interest rates a couple of weeks back by 50 basis points, we felt at that time that not only was demand weak, but also potentially there was some supply capacity, and therefore more demand would not necessarily immediately lead to much higher inflation, or at least the higher inflation would be within the bounds of what we felt comfortable with. That management process is what the central bank is trying to do. And so it's not that we hate the people and want to keep interest rates really high. It's that we have to manage this process. Last point, whenever we cut interest rates, there's another market. I'm talking about the market for goods and services. There's also an equilibration which has to be done between savings and investment. If I cut interest rates, a lot of people will want to invest. But will people want to save? After we cut interest rates this month, I get a lot of letters from pensioners who say, I used to get 9 and 10% on my deposits. Now I'm getting 7%. Is that fair? And my answer to them is, yes, it is fair because inflation has come down substantially. Earlier, you were getting 10% interest, but inflation was taking 10% off your principal. So you were in effect getting nothing. Today, you're getting 7% interest, but inflation is 5.5. So you're actually getting 1.5% benefit. So you're better off today than you were when you were getting 10%. That's something a lot of people don't realize, that their principal was losing value even though they got high rates of interest. Today, your principal is not losing value, at least your interest rate is compensating for that. So these are balancing acts we have to perform. Sometimes people don't understand, which is why we have to explain, but it's a balancing act.
Sir, would you kindly highlight or share the major objective of your popular paper? Has financial development made the world riskier?
A paper I wrote in 2005 And the basic concern at that time was that financial firms were perhaps getting a little too aggressive and writing a whole set of contracts which one worried whether they'd be able to service those contracts, whether they'd be able to get away without significant losses. The reason it's become a little more well-known is because it was presented at Alan Greenspan's farewell conference, and it was it was probably one paper which questioned whether we were in a good place at that time. Of course, the reaction at that time in 2005 was we're in a splendid place, things are going very well in the world economy, and don't worry, be happy. Turns out we were probably a little happier than we should have been. So there's the problem with a paper like that is most people then expect you to predict the next crisis and the crisis after that and so on. I think the truth is crises are extremely difficult to predict, and they often occur in places you wouldn't think of. Very few people were looking at risks from China in the past few years because China had always done the right things. And they may still end up doing the right things to balance their economy, but at least now there's greater concern of a potential significant slowing down in China and the fact that the Chinese authorities have a significant set of issues on their hands. This was not something that people thought of maybe a year or two back. They thought China is slowing, but they'll manage to slow down reasonably, and China will continue growing at its very fast pace for a long, long time.
Very good morning to you, sir. Here is my question. What is the state of health of PSU banks and private sector banks? Can they revive?
Both PSU banks and private sector banks are reasonably well capitalized. Private sector banks better capitalized than the PSU banks. They do have stressed assets on the balance sheets. Again, public sector banks more than the private sector banks, in part because public sector banks lent significantly more to infrastructure in the last few years than the private sector banks. And infrastructure has been subject to all those issues that I talked about, environmental issues, asset allocation issues, resource allocation issues, and so on, and therefore have slowed down more than some of the other areas that the private sector banks have lent to. We're trying to help in the cleanup of the system. As I've said repeatedly, is a four-step process: one, of recognition of the bad loans in the system; two, of resolving the bad loan situation by bringing all the parties to the table, saying who needs to do what, and putting the underlying projects back on track. That's number two. And if it can't be put on track, closing it down, taking the resources elsewhere. The third aspect is that given that the banks have recognized this problem and recognized the losses associated with it, they need capital to absorb the losses. And number four is, once this is done, you have to monitor that the plan that you put in place to put the asset back on track is on track. And if it goes off track, that has to be dealt with quickly. In all this, speed is of the essence. You let an asset which is going bad, a project which is going bad, fester without any action. You pretend it's a performing asset. The hole that you have to fill, the difficulty of dealing with it gets bigger and bigger over time. So again and again, our approach to the banks has been clean up quickly and clean up now. And we're working with the banks on it. We've given them a lot of new powers, and now we're going to push them very hard to do this cleanup.
Good morning, sir. So my question is, after RBI Governor, what is your dream job? Also, what would you like to do? What do you plan to do after this job to bring economic development in India?
This falls in the category of hypothetical questions. And if you ever take a course in dealing with the the first thing they teach you is never answer a hypothetical question. Right? So I will use that and say I'm perfectly happy with my job, and I'm not looking beyond it at this point. But that aside, I'm actually, just as an aside, I'm quite surprised and at the variety of schools that are represented here, and of course the high quality of the questions. And one thing I should have said in my talk, which I didn't, is what a pleasure it is for my colleagues and I to come to the state of Mizoram and to the city of Aizawl and to see the warmth and affection of the people, the range of cultural activities. Of course, we saw a bamboo dance yesterday. We've seen bamboo dances, I'm sure many of us have seen it in the past, but seeing close and seeing the dexterity of the dancers was just tremendous. But now, seeing the human capital that is available in the state, my hope, and in conversations with the governor and the chief minister, I think repeatedly the issue of increasing connectivity in the state, physical connectivity, ICT connectivity, and thereby linking it up to all the big markets, both inside the country as well as outside the country, I think is extremely important and would give all the students in this room access to the many opportunities that I think the state can absolutely have.
Okay, thank you, sir. My question is regarding to Mizoram Rural Bank. As we all know, Mizoram Rural Bank is expanding its branches in urban areas, while many rural areas are still remain uncovered. Sir, my question is why MRB are not established in interior villages where such services are really essential to promote the banking habits of the people? Thank you, sir.
I will say that even in urban areas, there are significant underserved populations. So it's a myth to think that in a number of that urban areas are well served. They may have a lot of banks, but it may be that there are underserved populations that still don't go into a bank, even though the bank is next door, because they feel culturally uncomfortable going to the bank doesn't reach out to them, the bank is too costly, and so on. So there are opportunities even in urban areas for expanding financial services. But the point you make is a good one, that is, rural areas are even more underserved than urban areas. We need to find ways of serving them. Now, historically, and even today, many rural areas feel they're served only if there's a physical branch there. But even though there's demand for a physical branch, from the bank's perspective, it can be quite costly posting somebody there. And often they don't find people living in the village who can do the job, so they recruit from outside. The person from outside doesn't have the local knowledge, etc., and is also quite desperate to go back to the town that they come from. So what we need to do is make sure that supply is also there. And increasingly, there are some interesting models of how supply can be done in a local way. So the business correspondent model is one where you recruit somebody from the local area who can serve as the outreach of the bank, but you also have to find ways for that business correspondent to do a number of activities, including possibly giving loans, so long as you have adequate controls over them. A number of institutions are finding ways to do this. We've licensed a whole set of new institutions which we hope will expand on this, called the Small Finance Bank, and my hope is they will reach out. In fact, one of the conditions of the application process was how much are you going to do in the Northeast? And I think a number of them have plans to expand in the Northeast, and we'll see how that goes.
Good morning, sir. Sir, I heard that there is a team under RBI Governor who is responsible for giving the interest rate for banks. So I would like to know that who are the team members and what kind of data do they use for giving out the interest rate, sir? Thank you.
Well, this is sort of the core team. And of course, Dr. Michael Patra has about 20, 30 people working for him on these issues, putting together the graphs, the tables, we also consult widely. We talk to industry, we talk to bankers, we talk to other economists. After all this consulting, and we also talk to the government, the finance minister and the prime minister. After all this consulting, we sit in a room and we say, okay, now we've heard everybody, what do we do? And based on our graphs, based on our models, based on our understanding, as well as the consultation, we decide how we set the interest rate. Ultimately, the decision is made by a very small group. And of course, we also have our colleagues in the bank participating in this discussion, including the other deputy governors.
So my question is, can India see a recession of its own kind in next 15 years? We all know that a lot of Indians are working for US and UK based firms. If there is a recession there, ultimately they will be out of job. So will it not lead a recession in India? And if yes, then do we have a backup plan for that?
If I don't answer it carefully, the headline tomorrow will be quite awkward. Economies go through ups and downs. I don't think economics has learned enough to avoid downturns. This is why every industrial economy goes through booms or recoveries, plateau, and then recession, then recovery, recession, so on. Every 9-10 years, right? Now, developing countries, some of them have found ways to grow for a long time without a downturn. China, most recent example. But eventually, the old pattern of growth runs out, and you have to discover new patterns. China is in the process of shifting over from an export-led, investment-led model to a domestic growth, consumption-led model. And in the shift over, it is slowing down somewhat. Still, it's even the worst estimates are 4.5%, 5%. Official estimates are 7%. That's still a very healthy rate of growth. If India follows that kind of model, maybe it can grow for a long time without a significant downturn based on the need for domestic demand based on development. But if it goes along the Western industrial country model after some time, then perhaps we may see a more regular business cycle with downturns over time. It's hard to foresee at this point which model will happen, but it's far enough away that we're not planning for it right now. Right now we're planning for a recovery, which we're in the midst of.
A very good morning to you, sir. So my question will be regarding to the Northeast economy, and before that, we have learned that our country, ever since 1991, during the time of Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, we have been dealing with issues and strategies regarding the low-gas policy, and then now the ag-gas policy. And Northeast has become one of the most important gateway regarding this low-gas and ag-gas policy. Yet, Northeast exactly is in a position of massive need of infrastructure and investment from corporates. So my question is, sir, how can RBI play a role where the interest could be created for investment from corporates and for the infrastructure development?
Typically, economics says that finance doesn't lead. Finance is the supporter of growth, but doesn't lead growth. Growth comes from other sources. So you're absolutely right, we need the investment. As the investment plans are put into place, there should be financing available for that. But first, the investment has to come. And my guess is the Look East policy, the Act East policy, is first about building the infrastructure, which will connect these states to larger markets outside. And as that infrastructure is built out, the cost of doing business here will fall. I mean, I think somebody yesterday was talking about the cost of a brick in Aizawl, which may be 20%, 30% higher than the cost of bricks in the plains. But that's because it has to be brought at high cost. If the cost of transportation was reduced, the cost of construction would fall tremendously in some of the hilly areas, right? That would allow you to build showrooms, build service centers, build business process outsourcing centers, where some of the rich talent in this state could be showcased or could work. So I think there's a little bit of chicken and egg, but in chicken and egg, I think here first the chicken comes, which is investment. As the investment happens, I think the rest of the stuff will happen. And because it's infrastructure investment, government financed or government supported investment, the issue of financing is not critical at that point. The issue of financing becomes more critical once that investment is in place and businesses want to set up. This becomes a much more commercially viable area, which I hope will happen in the next few years. Then financing should also be available. What is RBI doing? We have committed to set up offices in each of the northeastern states. In fact, yesterday we opened an office in Aizawl. Today my colleague is going to open an office in Imphal. So we are opening offices. Those offices are large enough to support any financial activity that emerges. And my hope is that there are right now sub-offices of the regional office in Guwahati, but they will become full-fledged offices as development happens. So we're ready to expand to support. In fact, we've expanded now in advance of what we hope will come in the next few years, and we're ready to support any activity.
Thank you, sir. My question is the cost of money in Northeast cheaper than other states? If yes, why banks and other companies come to Northeast and raise funds for Northeast development?
No, I don't think the cost of money is necessarily cheaper or costlier in the Northeast. We, largely have a unified Indian market, and therefore the cost of money doesn't necessarily change a lot between different states. The same banks which are here, State Bank of India, for example, is going to be able to borrow if it needs to finance activity in the Northeast by issuing bonds in the Mumbai market. And so there's no reason why the cost of money should be that different here, because it is a unified bank. What may be different is their perceptions of local business risk. And as I said again, when the business opportunities emerge in a greater way, when the cost of doing business comes down, both of which I think will happen when this infrastructure gets built out, I have no doubt that the extent of lending in the state will increase substantially and very quickly.
Is our banking sector user-friendly? Why is that so many people complain that banks do not cooperate in financing their self-support?
The truth is, across the world, small businesses always complain about lack of financing. Every entrepreneur is convinced he has the best idea in the world. It's only those stupid banks that aren't financing it. If only they would recognize he was a genius, his problems would be over. That's the nature of entrepreneurship. You have to believe in yourself more than anybody else is willing to believe. But the nature of banking is, show me the money, show me your revenues, right? There is this criticism of banks, not totally unfair, that they're willing to lend to those who don't need loans. And they're not willing to lend to those who need the loans. I think it's unfair, but it's not totally unfair. Obviously, the bank wants a good credit. Everybody wants to lend to the company that is very profitable, because then they're confident of getting their money back. Now, true banking is about taking a little bit of risk, but not taking too much. So if you come with an idea which is really crazy, really wacky, it's hard for a bank to finance that. So the entrepreneur feels angry, the bank feels it's doing its job. That's the nature of things.
Good morning, sir. My question is, how are commercial and nationalized banks gearing up to support present government slogans like Startup India, Make in India, Act East policy, etc., especially financing new startups and entrepreneurs in Northeast India? Thank you.
Well, on this financing new startups, the government has this Mudra program where it's trying to finance new startups. Now, as I said earlier, what we need here is banks to go out to find credit-worthy prospects that they can finance. Now, to the last question, one of the issues is getting bankers to get more integrated with the local area, with the local information, know who's creditworthy and who's not. And hopefully some of this mudra activity will push them to get more entrenched in the neighborhood and understand what activities are worth financing and go out and finance them even if they're at relatively small scale. So this is part of, I think, the public sector banks supporting the government push to small and medium enterprises. Of course, from a regulator's perspective, we have to make sure that the credit decisions are made as good credit decisions. It's in nobody's interest, neither the entrepreneur, nor the government, nor the banks, to make poor credit decisions where the money goes and can't be repaid, because that creates unpayable debt.
Some questions regarding to promoting tribal women entrepreneurship. Sir, as we know, India's northeast tribal states like Mizoram, Nagaland, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya have a high percentage of women ownership of MSME units in the country. So my question is that, sir, can RBI formulate a separate banking packages to promote and help tribal women entrepreneurship in the region? Thank you, sir.
Our sister organization, NABARD, has a very active program in creating self-help groups of women who are then linked to banks after they build up a certain level of savings, linked to banks, and it's about promoting entrepreneurship amongst women, but more generally in the area. Now, the key to these kinds of efforts is not just the money, it's also helping them with effectively business consulting, teaching them where the markets are, giving them perhaps some access to markets and so on. So in a number of states, there has been a very active combination of government, NABARD, sometimes private banks, but public banks, public sector banks, to create this ecosystem for good self-help groups. In Bihar, for example, there's a Jivika program run by the state government. So I think that we need all these elements to come together, and certainly NABARD and our efforts will be to support this kind of activity, and I hope it will achieve what you're looking for.
How would the new bank help in the growth of the Northeast? And we know that the Northeast has a lot of potential growth and youth. So what is the strategy of the RBI for financial inclusiveness?
As I said, these payment banks are perhaps the most appropriate structure to reach remote areas because they're relatively low-cost structures. They already have existing businesses in those remote areas. You know, cell phones have penetrated everywhere in the country. So cell phone kiosks are everywhere. If those kiosks are everywhere, the money, cash in, cash out, is possible to be transferred to the remotest areas in the country. So that is one way that we help promote financial inclusion. You can have your account in a bank, but use the payment bank to access your bank account. That would be very, very beneficial. But the second way is through these small finance banks. They're more attuned to giving, when I say small finance banks, these need not be necessarily small organizations. They're about finance to the small guy, to the SMEs, to the small farmer. So they're more attuned to giving loans in small doses. In fact, that has been their bread and butter business. And as we give them access to cheaper funding via deposits, our hope is that they will reach out to the small entrepreneur everywhere. Some of these banks have, some of these entities that we've given license to are already doing a roaring business in lending to vendors, lending to street vendors, to small shops, enterprises. And I have no doubt that one of our criteria for application is what do you plan to do in the Northeast? And many of these have stated their desire, if they're not already in the Northeast, to open new outfits there, and we will monitor that process. So our hope is that they will reach out and finance in a much more effective way in the Northeast than today. But of course, I would also add again what I've kept saying, we need that infrastructure to be built. That will create such a big difference, and I hope many of you will see that difference in the years to come.
A very good morning to you, sir. Sir, my question is, in our textbooks we read that Reserve Bank controls the entire monetary sector by using different instruments. If that is so, how is that parallel economy is sometimes more powerful than officially circulating economy? Is there any structural weakness or any functional weakness? Thank you, sir.
I do think the size of the parallel economy is often overstated. Now, I can't tell you what exactly the size of the parallel economy is in India. There are lots of studies, there are a range of estimates. But if you look at other countries where measurement is perhaps a little more effective, rarely does the size of the parallel economy exceed 10 to 20% of the country's economy, official economy. Now, the fact there does not need to apply here, but I do think that as we go ahead, the fact that more and more transactions are becoming electronic, more and more transactions can be tracked, and more if we can use the unique ID, we can find out who has what where as a regulator so that we can make sure that all of it is actually tax paying and above board. I think if all these are put into play, we will have an economy which has a relatively small black money sector. We need to squeeze the space available for black money. And the way we do it is by easing the process of becoming formal. That also means that some of the costs of becoming formal we have to look at. Some small enterprises don't become formal because they fear harassment by the inspector of factories or by the tax inspector. So we have to reduce those kinds of costs. But then that will allow more and more entities to become formal. One of the places we have done this is in the tax rate. There used to be a time the marginal tax rate in India used to be 98%, and if you added wealth tax, you were above 100%. So you were paying more than the amount you earned as tax. That's an unsustainable level of tax. Nobody's going to pay that. Today, with the marginal tax rate on the richest taxpayer being 33%, give or take a surcharge, I think this is something which is eminently payable, and if you're avoiding this kind of tax, shame on you.
Okay, sir, my question is related to gold, and I have 3 points. Question number 1, how has gold monetization helped India as of now? And if people monetize gold, what will be India's status as an importer? And finally, does India have good gold base to absorb economic shocks in situation of the collapse?
It's a very, very good point. I mean, those who want to monetize gold, which is part of the government's plans, essentially look at a hoard of about 25,000 tons. It's an enormous hoard of gold, and they say, well, if this stuff is lying idle, why not bring it out and let those who want to buy gold buy from the hoard, right? So what we have to be careful about any scheme for monetization is that it actually takes money from this hoard, brings it out, takes gold from this hoard, brings it out, and gives it to those who need fresh gold. What we have to be careful in these schemes is we don't create fresh demand for gold over and above the 25,000 tons that is there, which will then increase the imports, right? So that's really the tension in these schemes. We have to, the government has suggested a couple of schemes which it's going to implement. And the hope is, if, for example, you're buying a gold bond, that instead of buying gold as a preserver of value, which a number of families like to do, they like to buy gold to preserve value, they will instead buy a gold bond, which will then ensure the money will flow into the economy and not get stuck in gold. In a sense, gold as an investment, if the gold bond can substitute for, we would buy less gold. That would be a good thing. So that's the hope. Similarly, with the gold deposit, you take your gold to a bank, the bank takes the gold, gives you money in return, and then lends that gold out to somebody else who needs gold. So again, at least temporarily, you don't have to buy from outside. Now we have to see how these schemes work and whether in fact they reduce the demand for gold. Let's see.
Good morning, sir. I have a very simple and direct question. Is the RBI functioning free from unfair influences from politicians and ministers?
Yes. No, just to give you a broader answer, because this is the last question. We listen to the larger public, which includes people like you, which includes politicians, which includes government administrators. We hear what they have to say, and sometimes they have useful things to say which we have been overlooking. But ultimately, any decision is ours. And I think I speak for all my colleagues when we say we certainly make decisions that we think are in the best interests of the country. Sometimes they may not look, people hearing those decisions may not accept them. Sometimes they run against what is most expedient in the short run. But we make these decisions in the long run interests of the country. And I think the broader public respects that. They respect an institution which takes its decisions on that basis. It's not, again, let me emphasize that we ignore what we hear. We do pay attention, but we try and take the best decision given that information.